The morning mist clung to the towering pines of the Oregon Territory like ghostly fingers, muffling the sounds of the forest. October 1875 brought an early chill that bit through even the thickest wool coats, and the ground crunched with frost beneath heavy boots. 4 men rode through the dense woodland, their breath visible in the cold air, their eyes scanning the forest with predatory intent. Jake Morrison spat tobacco juice into the undergrowth, his weathered face twisted into a permanent scowl. At 43, he'd spent half his life hunting. First animals, then something far more profitable. "Tracks fresh," he muttered to his companions, pointing to barely visible footprints in the soft earth. "Can't be more than an hour ahead." Behind him, the youngest of the group, Tommy Brennan, shifted nervously in his saddle. At 19, this was only his second hunting expedition, and his stomach still churned at what they were planning. But Morrison paid well, and Tommy's family needed the money desperately. His conscience was a luxury he couldn't afford. "There," whispered Bill Carver, the group's tracker, pointing through a gap in the trees. "By the creek." Through the morning haze, they could see her. A young Nez Perce woman, perhaps 18 years old, kneeling by the water's edge. Her long black hair caught what little sunlight filtered through the canopy as she filled a leather water pouch. She wore traditional buckskin clothing decorated with intricate beadwork and moved with the quiet grace of someone raised in harmony with the wilderness. Ayanna had ventured further from her village than usual, drawn by the abundance of medicinal herbs that grew near this particular creek. Her grandmother had taught her their uses, and with winter approaching, she needed to gather as many as possible. She had no idea that her knowledge and beauty had made her a target. Morrison raised his hand, signaling the others to spread out. They'd done this before. Surround the target, cut off escape routes, move fast and quiet. The girl would fetch a good price at McKinnon's trading post, where certain wealthy men paid handsomely for exotic companions. Morrison told himself it was just business, but deep down, he knew exactly what kind of monster he'd become. The attack came swift and brutal. Ayanna heard the horses before she saw them, but by then it was too late. She leaped to her feet, water pouch forgotten, and ran toward the thick underbrush where horses couldn't follow. But Carver had anticipated this. He came crashing through the vegetation from the side, his rope already spinning. "Help me!" Ayanna screamed in her native tongue. Then in English, "Please, somebody help!" But they were miles from any settlement, and her voice was swallowed by the vast forest. The rope caught her around the waist, jerking her to the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. As she struggled to rise, Morrison dismounted and approached with practiced efficiency. "Easy now, girl," he said, his voice deceptively calm. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He pulled out a length of rope and began binding her hands behind her back. Ayanna fought with desperate strength, landing a solid kick to his shin that made him curse, but there were too many of them. Tommy watched from his horse, his face pale. The girl couldn't be much younger than his own sister back home. When she looked directly at him, her dark eyes blazing with defiance and terror, he had to look away. This wasn't what he'd signed up for, but he was in too deep now to back out. Within minutes, Ayanna was trussed up and thrown across the back of Morrison's horse like a sack of grain. Her shoulders struck the saddle horn painfully, and she bit back a cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing her pain. "McKinnon's expecting us by Thursday," Morrison said, mounting up behind his captive. "That gives us 3 days to get to the trading post. We'll take the old mining trail through Bear Creek Canyon. Less chance of running into any patrols." As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Ayanna's mind raced. She knew these forests better than any white man, had learned their secrets from her grandfather, a respected tracker and hunter. If she could escape, she could lose them in the maze of ravines and hidden caves that honeycombed the region. But first, she needed to free her hands. The temperature continued to drop as they climbed higher into the mountains, and soon snow began to fall in lazy, fat flakes. Morrison pulled his coat tighter and urged his horse faster. They needed to make good time if they were going to reach the halfway shelter before nightfall. Behind them, unseen and unheard, something large moved through the trees, following their trail with patient, predatory interest. Snow continued to fall as the hunting party made their way deeper into the Cascade Mountains, the flakes growing thicker and more persistent with each passing hour. The old mining trail was treacherous under the best conditions. Now, with a layer of fresh snow concealing the loose rocks and hidden roots, it became downright dangerous. Morrison's horse picked its way carefully along the narrow path that hugged the mountainside. To their left, the forest dropped away into a steep ravine where Bear Creek rushed over boulders far below. To their right, granite cliffs rose almost vertically, their faces slick with ice and snow. One wrong step could send them tumbling into the abyss. Ayanna had been quiet for the past hour, her body rigid against Morrison's chest. But her silence wasn't resignation. It was calculation. She'd been working steadily at the ropes binding her wrists, using the motion of the horse to disguise her efforts. The rough hemp was beginning to fray against the small knife she'd managed to keep hidden in her sleeve, a gift from her father that she always carried. "Getting colder," muttered Bill Carver, pulling his hat down over his ears. "Might be we should have taken the valley route after all, Jake." Morrison shook his head. "Too many settlements down there. Word gets around about what we're carrying, we'll have half the territorial government on our backs. This way's cleaner." Tommy Brennan brought up the rear, his young face pinched with cold and growing unease. The higher they climbed, the more isolated they became, and something about these mountains felt wrong to him. He'd grown up hunting in the Ohio forests, but this wilderness had a different quality. Older, wilder, less forgiving. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats, and he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder. "You hear that?" he called out suddenly, causing the others to halt their horses. They sat in silence, listening. The only sounds were the whisper of falling snow, the creak of leather, and the distant rush of water from the ravine below. But Tommy could have sworn he'd heard something else. A low rumble, almost like thunder, but from directly behind them. "Hear what?" Morrison snapped, impatient to keep moving. Nothing, I guess. Thought I heard something following us." Carver laughed harshly. "Boys jumping at shadows. Ain't nothing up here but trees and rocks." But even as he spoke, Carver's experienced eyes were scanning the trail behind them. He'd been hunting and trapping in these mountains for over 20 years, and he knew when something was out of place. The forest was too quiet. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was as if every living thing had gone into hiding. As they resumed their journey, Ayanna felt a strand of rope finally part against her blade. She forced herself not to react, knowing that any sudden movement might give away her progress. Instead, she began testing the remaining bonds, finding the weak points where the hemp had worn thin. Her grandmother had always told her that the mountains had their own spirit, their own way of protecting those who respected them. Ayanna had spent countless hours in these forests, learning their moods and seasons, understanding the delicate balance that kept the ecosystem thriving. These men were like a disease in the forest's body, something that needed to be purged. The trail began to narrow even further as they approached a particularly treacherous section known locally as Devil's Backbone. Here, the path was barely wide enough for a single horse, with a sheer drop on one side and overhanging rocks on the other. Morrison knew they'd have to dismount and lead the horses through the most dangerous part. "Everyone down," he ordered, swinging his leg over and sliding from the saddle. He grabbed Ayanna roughly by the arm and pulled her down as well, not bothering to cushion her fall. She hit the rocky ground hard, jarring her injured shoulder, but managed to keep from crying. "Out. Tie her to my horse," Morrison told Carver. "Last thing we need is her making a run for it while we're navigating this mess." But as Carver approached with another length of rope, A sound echoed through the canyon that made all four men freeze in their tracks. It was a roar, deep, primal, and unmistakably challenging. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the cliff walls and rolling through the forest like an avalanche. The horses reared and whinnied in terror, pulling against their reins with wild eyes. Morrison's mount nearly broke, free, forcing him to use both hands to maintain control. "What in hell was that?" Tommy whispered, his voice barely audible over the horse's panic. Before anyone could answer, they saw it. Through the swirling snow, a massive dark shape emerged from the trees behind them. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for a boulder or a fallen log, but then it reared up on its hind legs, revealing its true nature. The grizzly bear stood nearly 8 feet tall, its massive frame scarred from countless battles with both nature and man. Its thick brown fur was marked with silver around the muzzle, indicating advanced age, but there was nothing frail about the creature. Its small, intelligent eyes fixed on the hunting party with unmistakable menace, and when it dropped back to all fours, the ground seemed to shake beneath its weight. Morrison's hand went instinctively to his rifle, but he didn't draw it yet. A wounded grizzly was infinitely more dangerous than a wary one, and at this distance, there was no guarantee of a clean kill. "Nobody move," he hissed. "Bears don't usually attack unless they're threatened or protecting cubs." But this bear wasn't behaving like a typical grizzly. Instead of ambling away or making a show of dominance before retreating, it began walking slowly toward them, its massive head swaying from side to side as it tested the air. And strangest of all, its attention seemed focused not on the men or their horses, but on Ayanna. The young woman stared at the approaching giant with a mixture of awe and recognition. Something about the bear's scarred face and intelligent eyes seemed familiar, though she couldn't place where she might have seen it before. More importantly, she realized this might be her only chance to escape. The ancient grizzly continued his deliberate advance, each massive paw print in the snow marking his inexorable approach. His breath formed great clouds in the frigid air as he tested the scents carried on the wind: fear, gunpowder, leather, and something else that stirred memories buried deep in his primitive brain. Morrison's finger tightened on his rifle trigger, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. He'd faced down bears before, but this one was different. The creature moved with purpose rather than mere territorial aggression, and those ancient eyes held an intelligence that made Morrison's skin crawl. "Jake," Carver whispered, his own weapon, now in his hands. "We need to do something. That thing's going to be on top of us in 30 seconds. Tommy had backed against the cliff face, his young face white with terror. He'd never seen a grizzly this close, and the sheer size of the beast defied belief. The bear had to weigh close to 600 pounds, all muscle and claw and primal fury, but Ayanna felt something entirely different as she watched the great bear approach. The final strands of rope binding her wrists had parted completely now, though she kept her hands positioned as if still bound. More importantly, she was beginning to understand why this encounter felt familiar. 3 years ago, she had been gathering berries with her younger cousin near this same trail when they'd stumbled upon a young grizzly caught in a trap set by white hunters. The bear's leg had been mangled by the steel jaws, and infection was already setting in. Her cousin had wanted to flee, but Ayanna had insisted they help the suffering animal. Working carefully over several hours, they'd managed to free the bear and treat his wounds with traditional medicines. The grateful creature had looked at her with those same intelligent eyes before limping away into the forest. Could this be the same bear, now grown to full maturity? The grizzly stopped just 20 feet away, close enough that they could see the individual scars crisscrossing his massive frame. He raised his great head and sniffed the air again, then fixed his gaze directly on Morrison. A low rumble built in his chest, not quite a growl, but unmistakably threatening. "Easy, boy," Morrison said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "We're just passing through." Don't want any trouble. But the bear's attention shifted to Ayanna, and his demeanor changed subtly. The aggressive posture relaxed slightly, and he made a sound that was almost questioning, a deep chuff of recognition. Then his massive head swung back toward the hunters, and the menace returned tenfold. "He knows," Ayanna said quietly, speaking for the first time since her capture. "He remembers." "Remembers what?" Morrison demanded, not taking his eyes off the bear. "Remembers kindness," she replied, "and he recognizes cruelty." The bear took another step forward, and now Morrison could see the old trap scars on the creature's left rear leg. The metal had left permanent marks, visible even through the thick fur. Understanding dawned in the hunter's eyes, followed immediately by a surge of desperate anger. "You know this animal?" he snarled at Ayanna. "I helped heal him once, when your kind left him to die in agony." Morrison's face twisted with rage. The last thing he needed was some mystical connection between his captive and a 1,000-pound killing machine. "Well, your bear friend's about to get himself shot full of holes." He raised his rifle, but before he could take aim, Ayanna moved. Her freed hands shot forward, shoving Morrison hard enough to spoil his shot. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the air, the sharp crack echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The sound galvanized the grizzly into action. With a roar that seemed to shake the very mountains, he charged forward with surprising speed for such a massive creature. Morrison stumbled backward, desperately trying to work the lever action on his rifle, but there wasn't time. Carver and Tommy opened fire simultaneously, their bullets striking the charging bear in the shoulder and flank. But the wounds only seemed to enrage him further, and grizzlies were notoriously difficult to bring down quickly. The bear crashed into Morrison with the force of an avalanche, sending him flying backward toward the cliff edge. Ayanna didn't waste the opportunity. As the other hunters focused their attention on the rampaging bear, she rolled away from the melee and scrambled toward a narrow gap in the rocks where she could take cover. Her shoulder screamed in protest, but adrenaline carried her forward. Morrison hit the ground hard, his rifle spinning away into the snow. The bear reared up above him, massive paws poised to deliver a killing blow, but something held him back. Instead of attacking the fallen man, the grizzly looked toward Ayanna as if seeking guidance. "Kill him!" Morrison screamed at his companions. "Kill that damn thing!" But their shots were going wild in the chaos, and the bear's thick hide and layers of fat were absorbing the bullets without slowing him down significantly. Tommy's hands shook so badly he could barely hold his rifle steady, and Carver was having trouble getting a clear shot with Morrison directly beneath the bear. The grizzly seemed to make a decision. Instead of finishing off Morrison, he turned and began advancing on the other two hunters. Blood flowed from his wounds, staining the snow bright red, but his movements remained strong and purposeful. These men had hurt him, and more importantly, they had been about to hurt the human who had once shown him kindness. "Run!" Carver shouted to Tommy. "We can't stop him!" But there was nowhere to run. Behind them lay only the narrow trail they'd just traversed, and ahead waited the treacherous Devil's Backbone passage. To their left, the cliff dropped away into the abyss, and to their right, solid rock walls rose toward the sky. The bear seemed to understand their predicament perfectly. He positioned himself between the hunters and the trail, effectively trapping them against the cliff face. His message was clear. They weren't leaving this place until he decided to let them go. From her hiding place among the rocks, Ayanna watched the standoff with growing amazement. The great bear had not only remembered her kindness from 3 years ago, but he had somehow understood that she needed help. Now he was risking his own life to protect her from the men who would have sold her into slavery. But she could see that his wounds were serious. Blood loss was beginning to take its toll, and if the confrontation continued much longer, even his great strength would fail him. She had to end this quickly, before any more blood was shed. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with the massive grizzly blocking the hunter's escape route, while blood from his bullet wounds slowly stained the pristine snow. Morrison had managed to crawl away from the cliff edge, but his rifle remained out of reach, half buried in a snowdrift. Carver and Tommy stood frozen against the rock wall, their weapons trained on the bear, but their hands shaking too badly to aim effectively. Ayanna knew she had to act quickly. The great bear was weakening from blood loss, and despite his size and strength, 4 armed men could eventually bring him down if the fight continued. More importantly, she could see something in the creature's eyes that the hunters couldn't. This wasn't about territorial aggression or even self-defense anymore. This was about justice, delivered by an intelligence far older and more profound than human law. "Stop!" she called out, emerging from her hiding place with her hands visible but no longer bound. "Enough blood has been spilled." Morrison spun toward her, his face contorted with rage and desperation. "You little savage! Look what you've done!" But Ayanna ignored him, instead walking slowly toward the wounded grizzly. The bear's small eyes tracked her movement, and the rumbling in his chest gradually quieted. When she was close enough to touch him, she placed her hand gently on his massive shoulder, feeling the power and warmth beneath the thick fur. "Thank you, old friend," she whispered in her native tongue, "but let me finish this." The bear seemed to understand. He stepped aside, though he remained ready to intervene if the men threatened her again. Ayanna turned to face her captors, and for the first time since the ordeal began, she looked them directly in the eyes. "You were going to sell me," she said, her voice steady despite the trauma she'd endured. "Like an animal at market, to men who would use me and discard me when they grew tired." Tommy's rifle barrel drooped toward the ground. The shame in his young face was unmistakable. We didn't, I mean—" "Yes, you did," Ayanna continued. "You knew exactly what you were doing. And you convinced yourselves it was acceptable because I'm not white, not Christian, not civilized in your eyes." Morrison struggled to his feet, his face purple with fury. "You're talking to your betters, girl. You should be grateful we don't just leave you up here to freeze." The grizzly's head swung toward Morrison at the hostile tone, a warning growl building in his throat. But Ayanna raised her hand, and the great beast held his position. "Betters?" she repeated, and for the first time there was steel in her voice. "Look around you, Morrison. Look at what your superiority has brought you to. You're trapped on a mountain trail, bleeding and broken, at the mercy of the very savage you plan to sell." She began walking in a slow circle around the 3 men, and they turned to keep her in sight like prey animals watching a predator. "I know these mountains better than you know your own backyards. I could lose you in a maze of canyons and leave you to wander until you freeze or starve. Or I could simply walk away and let my friend here finish what he started." Carver licked his lips nervously. "Now hold on, girl. Maybe we can work something out. Nobody has to get hurt here." "Nobody has to get hurt?" Ayanna's laugh was bitter. "You've already hurt me. You've hurt him." She gestured toward the wounded bear. "You've hurt every person your kind has ever kidnapped and sold. The only question now is what happens next." She stopped her circling and faced them squarely. "Here's what you're going to do. You're going to leave your weapons here in the snow. You're going to take your horses and ride back the way you came. And you're never going to set foot in tribal territory again." Morrison's hand inched toward a knife at his belt. "Like hell, we are. You can't—" The grizzly's roar cut him off mid-sentence, a sound so primal and threatening that it seemed to shake snow from the overhanging branches. The bear rose on his hind legs again, towering above them all, and Morrison's hand fell away from his weapon. "Choose quickly," Ayanna said calmly. "My friend is losing patience, and he's already been shot twice today. A 3rd time might make him decide that talking is pointless." Tommy was the first to crack. He threw his rifle down in the snow and raised his hands. "I'm sorry," he said, tears freezing on his cheeks. I'm so sorry. I never wanted this. I needed the money, but I never thought. I'm sorry. Ayanna studied his face and saw genuine remorse there. Then go home, Tommy Brennan. Go home to your family and find honest work. And remember what happened here when you're tempted to take another easy path. Carver hesitated a moment longer, then followed suit, dropping his weapon and backing slowly toward the horses. But Morrison remained, defiant even in defeat. This ain't over, girl. You can't stay hidden in these mountains forever. Someday you'll come down to trade or visit settlements, and when you do— When I do, Ayanna interrupted, I'll be traveling with friends from 3 different tribes, all of whom will know exactly who threatened me and why. Do you really want to spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when that debt will be collected? For the first time, genuine fear crept into Morrison's eyes. He'd heard stories about tribal justice, and he had no doubt that kidnapping one of their women would be considered an act of war. Slowly, reluctantly, he threw down his knife and rifle. "This is how it ends," Ayanna announced as the 3 men gathered their horses. "No grand shootout, no dramatic rescue. Just a young woman, an old bear, and the understanding that some wrongs carry their own punishment." As the hunters rode away into the falling snow, their heads down in defeat and shame, Ayanna turned her attention to the wounded grizzly. The great bear was sitting now, favoring his injured shoulder, but his eyes remained alert and focused on her. "Come on, old friend," she said softly. "Let's get those wounds cleaned before they fester. I know a place nearby where we can rest, safely." As they made their way down a hidden trail that only someone raised in these mountains could have found, Ayanna reflected on the day's events. The hunters had expected to find easy prey in the wilderness, a helpless young woman they could exploit for profit. Instead, they'd discovered that the mountains themselves had a way of balancing the scales of justice. The bear's intervention hadn't been supernatural or mystical. It had been the natural response of a creature who remembered kindness and recognized cruelty. In the harsh world of the frontier, such clarity was often more reliable than human laws or courts. By nightfall, they had reached a sheltered cave where Ayanna could tend to the grizzly's wounds using traditional healing methods passed down through generations of her people. As she worked, cleaning and bandaging the bullet holes with practiced skill, she spoke quietly to her patient. "You saved my life today," she said. "But more than that, you reminded those men that they're not the apex predators they thought they were. That in the wild, justice has a way of finding its own path." The great bear rumbled contentedly as her gentle hands worked to heal his injuries. Outside the cave, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of their passage and wiping clean, the evidence of the day's confrontation. By morning, it would be as if the encounter had never happened, except in the memories of those who lived through it. And in the vast wilderness of the American frontier, where law was often whatever men with guns decided it should be, those memories would serve as a powerful reminder that true justice sometimes wore fur and walked on 4 legs, protecting the innocent with tooth and claw when human institutions failed. As Ayanna settled down beside the sleeping bear to rest until dawn, she smiled at the thought of Morrison, Carver, and Tommy making their way back down the mountain trail. They would have a long, cold journey ahead of them, plenty of time to reflect on their choices and their consequences. The mountains had spoken. The message was clear. And in the morning, both she and her ancient guardian would be free.